We're finally here with Chapter 3 of the Legacy Antigen. My computer broke all the way down to the motherboard, so I haven't had a chance to talk about this chapter, and She Blinded Me with Science is very much the kind of chapter I wanted to see come out of the Legacy Antigen. Because we get to see a bunch of perspectives from the characters at hand in the situation, see what they think of what's going on, to give us some better perspective on the story at hand. And this chapter particularly also leads into this week's community chapter, which of course I also haven't talked about because I only just got my computer back. So, we'll try and smash through this chapter, as most everyone should probably be caught up on it by now. Well, you know why you're here. We all know why we're here. The Legacy Antigen. 203 people have already been admitted with bleeding eyes, and that number's climbing by the minute. If Kyrie's right, we have less than 3 days to find a cure. So it's interesting that, the amount of people that have been infected isn't too many. There's obviously something keeping a bunch of people from not experiencing the same symptoms as Bangalore. It would be surprising to me if nobody else within the Legends ever gets affected. Grandma would be so proud. The greatest scientific minds among the Legends, working together to save lives. I'm not exactly in touch with my inner scientist these days. Wraith's got a lot to get in touch with very soon. At least you were one. I don't know why I'm here. I'm just an engineer. This is definitely an arc I think is going to develop over this season, as we've seen from loading screens. Mirage's dad and his mum are on Olympus for this. His dad has a lot of doubts about sort of the family name, the legacy of the Witt family. Mirage here could be getting a nice boost throughout the season to his self-esteem by proving himself in the eyes of his dad. A guy who he says he doesn't really care about, as we see in Pathfinder's Quest, but him not being around has obviously had an effect on this guy's self-confidence, that proving himself in front of his dad is going to do a lot for him. And quite a little caustic over here. I like the shot composition here. I still, as I mentioned in my last video, I don't like a lot of the faces. These three, I really don't like the way that their faces look. They all really dip into this strange uncanny valley territory. Like, they don't look cartoonish in a good way like some of the prior seasons and a lot of the community comics go with. This personally just doesn't look aesthetically pleasing. This side of things is much better, and obviously it pays dividends with Caustic that we don't have to see his face. Hey, engineers are helpful. Yeah, Wattson, you tell him. If you want a giant weed whacker, would you rather glue people's faces to the ground? Whatever Crypto said I did, he's lying. That's again another piece of info from a loading screen, which, as I've seen Daniel Klein, one of the game developers, mention on Twitter at some point in time, they're not the best lore reveal medium, like by any means, because not everybody reads them. You have to go usually the whole way through the battle pass to read them, or you just go online at the beginning of the season to get all the context that you need to understand what they're trying to set up, like both of Mirage's parents being here. The timeline of unlocking them through that story, sure, can match the pacing of the story as it goes, and before the quests, they obviously were just for more background information or setting things up for the future. But as we got to this point, the info from the loading screens is starting to become a bit too integral and regularly referenced, to the point that a lot of people might have to keep searching on the internet what little references like this mean. That might just be a little issue as we go forward, that maybe moving loading screens to the first half of a battle pass, or making them free, or doing something like that so that everybody has all that lore in context, I think would be really good for everyone's understanding going forward. Especially if they're going to make a lore dossier in-game, unlocking loading screens, and certain people not having certain loading screens from certain seasons kind of just damages the community's interpretation of the lore all told. I like that they're bringing it into the story, but we now also need a lot more context within the framework of the game itself to help back that up. And admittedly, this page, these two faces I think are actually well done. I like the cartoonish nature that we're getting out of Horizon here. I would have liked a little puff to show that she's not speaking, because in my first read of this, I thought that she had something to say, because she looks like the only person actually speaking. Yeah, there's odd little things about the artwork for the in-game chapters that really doesn't sit with me. Enough. Let's get back to the story. Valkyrie, what are we up against? I encountered the vines when I found my dad's Titan. This is all information we sort of know, but it gives us a nice bit of context. No matter what I tried, they wouldn't come off. I found research papers in the wreckage and tracked down one of the scientists. So some people were evidently able to, like, get off Typhon or left Typhon before the end of Titanfall 2, right? They were genetically modifying the vines, weaponizing them, called it Project Legacy. So they weren't modified, theoretically, by the explosion caused by the Ark. This was a pre-existing genetic modification. What that genetic modification was being done with, and to do what, obviously remains to be seen. Their form of rapid regeneration evidently seems to be one of those things, as it is at least being pointed out as like a difference. We have seen non-modified Medusa Vines, theoretically, on Typhon in Titanfall 2, as well as on the Exoplanet map, which is again something I think we're going to have to keep an eye out for, is the only other place, aside from Olympus, that we've seen the Grow Foundation. And then Valkyrie actually leads us into something quite interesting here when she says, what do you expect from a planet like Typhon? Which I think Wraith might quietly take a little personally, because she's also meant to be from Typhon initially. This thing's from Typhon, but those ships aren't IMC or Ares. As we learn in, I think, the Director's Cut version of the prologue of Legacy Antigen, so the second chapter that officially released, the first community comic, that ship was called the ICS Icarus, whereas ships we know that were attached to the IMC are labelled as IMS. The IMS Thermopylae was at the battle on Typhon, and then somehow ended up on Salvo, and was then used for Fuse's introduction ceremony, and Bangalore had a past experience on the IMS Hestia, as we're going to dip into with her and Wraith's storyline, as was mentioned back in their audio-visual teaser from Season 8. After the Battle of Typhon, Bangalore's brother, along with several Ares scientists, used a fragment of the Ark to jump the IMS Hestia from Gridiron to the Outlands in the space of a year, when conventional phase travel should have taken them 20. And then several years later, having travelled round the Outlands on the IMS Hestia, the explosion that separated Bangalore and her brother occurred. Pathfinder's Quest also tells us that within that time, Jackson, Bangalore's brother, became close friends with a certain Ares scientist. As I went through in my Voidwalker's pilot knife video, Wraith being initially from Typhon, and the locations and the timeline of events means that she had to have been on the Hestia to have travelled from Typhon, i.e. the frontier, to the Outlands within that space of time. And it's how she was then one of the leading Ares scientists that set up Project Wraith in the Outlands, using remnants of the discovery from Typhon, the Ark. It was then obviously several years later that that Wraith swapped dimensions with our Wraith, leading to them being called Voidwalker. It seems very much so within that time that Bangalore took Voidwalker's pilot knife from her, and is what's going to lead into this week's community chapter. The point I'm trying to wrap back around to is that the ICS Icarus evidently does make sense to not be attached to these bodies. Learning what ICS and IMS actually stand for, whether it's like military and carrier in their respective acronyms, simple things like that could lead us to the body that actually originally controlled those ships, which could lead us back to the actual person that sent those ships out and that recalled them. Personally, the Grow Foundation, again, is the body to be keeping an eye on here, as they're the only ones involved in the multiple places that we see the Medusa Vines, and that aren't, officially as far as we know, IMC, because the IMC doesn't officially exist anymore. It sort of does through Hammond, but Hammond existed way before the IMC, and it's not Ares, because Ares was a division of the IMC, but obviously its own individual thing. The Grow Foundation at this point is probably a separate enough entity that it was initially in control of those ships, and possibly the genetic modification of Medusa Vines. That could also, as Valk tells us, just have been an IMC thing. And this is the Grow Foundation capitalizing on the research that they didn't initially have access to, something like that. We don't know anyone connected to the Grow Foundation, but if they are involved in any way, I imagine that's something to learn through this season instead. Indeed they're not, dearie. The serial number's been scratched off and the flight log's wiped clean. Whoever sent this monstrosity didn't want to be found. That's a concerning issue still. While the rest of you debate the history of a plant, I need to know how to keep Anita alive. I'll deal with who sent it later. Well, I really like this attitude, and it's very impressive to see, again, that Loba is backing up this side of the relationship by being so determined for Bangalore's sake, I think they are right in looking into who sent it. I think that figuring that out is going to be a much bigger clue than anything we have on sort of a scientific level at this point. Careful what you say, Loba. One of us could be a mole. And I like that Caustic is causing mischief, but it would be way too obvious, to be honest. Like, any repetition of the Broken Ghost sort of dynamic like that, yeah, I just don't think it's very sensible. Caustic is just too obvious to be the man on the inside at this point. What did you say? And I actually really like this face from Loba here. I think that's got real good aggression to it. Too soon? Dr. Caustic, we've discussed this. Your attitude. Do your worst, Miss Paquette. You going to electrocute me again? I get to watch 203 people die. Why would I want a cure? And yeah, he's got a point, but I think, again, the fact that he's just making some of this so obviously the point, I don't think he's the guy. I think that the writers are setting him up to be slightly too obvious for anyone who wants to take it that way, and for anyone who doesn't want to take it that way because of his prior role in The Broken Ghost. But then this obviously puts a spanner in the works, because a new patient was just admitted. And this is one of the ones we called. Her name is Katerina Ticacek, but she also goes by the name Mystik. That name ring any bells? Doctor? It should, because, as Pathfinder points out to these two, within Pathfinder's quest, something we've been wondering for a while, Katerina Ticacek Knox is Caustic's mother, if he were to be Alexander Knox, and if Crypto were to be Taejun Park, his foster mother would be Mystik. These two are now very, very much aware of the fact that they are foster brothers, something along that line, and the person that raised them and evidently may have led to some of their trauma, but also some of their hopes for their lives and the future, is now at risk. Is that something that Caustic would have done? I think from the way he talks about it, that he's trying to avoid his mother because essentially she's the one person he can probably still have some care for beyond his nihilism. He can't go and see his mum again because he will break. And he will be able to confess that death is not the end and that he needs to actually be a whole human person again. I think that's sort of part of the reasoning here and what having to save his mother will unveil out of him. And if that along the way can allow these two to settle their differences, because I think losing Caustic is either what led Katerina to start fostering children, or starting to foster children is what led to Caustic having some repressed distaste for his mum. Obviously, yeah, how he interacts with his mum is not set in stone. I think those are your sort of two distinct possibilities. Like, she's the core of his sociopathy, or she's the one thing that he can't allow himself to see because it will break his sociopathy. It will actively disprove his nihilism, if that makes sense. There's a lot of interesting shit to come out of the interaction between these three within this season, and how Wattson can use this situation to try and redeem him within himself. Redemption ultimately doesn't super matter on the surface. Based on what he's done, we can all judge Caustic for how many people he's apparently killed, regardless of how he grows out of it. But if the people that care about him and he himself can start to feel better about things or take a better path in life, that in itself is good enough. That redemption is earned on its own. We can then argue about that. Do you know what I mean? Whether he's worthy of any of it. I would hope that the story that they use to develop this out does show him to be worthy of it. Because this much we have no idea of until, I don't know, like a few hours from now. Again, my computer broke down. I have got very little time to actually develop on this before the next chapter comes out and proves me right or wrong in the first place. so don't take this video too seriously. There's elements of it that back up the community chapter that I will try and talk about alongside the new in-game chapter. As I said at the beginning, this chapter is kind of the chapter that I wanted. I wanted a sort of really like in-depth Hunter style chapter where each character got to give their own suspicions forward and their own bases for like access to the Icarus or motivation for the Vines themselves, discussing the relation between the Vines and Pathfinder's party, whether it's got anything to do with that, and the Vines themselves are just a cover-up, what sort of steps you can take to cure the legacy antigen and what implications that kind of thing can have, why only certain people are getting infected. The only really determinate plot point we got out of this is that the ICS Icarus definitely wasn't owned by the IMC or the Ares division, which does mean they were owned by an outside party which would have had its own interest in the genetically modified Medusa Vines and or the remains of the battle on Typhon. They could obviously have taken the Medusa Vines when they were actually originally there for remains of the Ark, for example. I do like that we had team science on the case, essentially, but for a real Hunter style information exploration chapter, team science was admittedly kinda wasted on this. We didn't get enough information on actually anything plot-wise to really take us anywhere. The character work that was done here was nice. I like seeing them interact on a personal level, trying to get a job done. Loba striking out as the real emotional core, like, fuck all of this bullshit, let's go actually help Anita, shall we? I like what that's putting forward. I really like the dilemma being presented by Crypto at the end. The fact that Mirage's first lines actually do suggest a bit more of what his overall arc is going to be like. I kind of keep forgetting that there's 11 in-game chapters this season, so this is only the third chapter. This is still setup. This is the first time we've actually seen some of these characters get their inciting incidents within the story itself. The director's cut version of the prologue did suggest that Katerina Ticacek was going to be here, a woman who said that a legend was her son, but wouldn't say who, which I saw some people trying to attach to Mirage's mum, but that would have been more like, couldn't say who. Also, her last name would be public enough for Grace Rasheed to know that that's who she was on about, so that wouldn't have been Mirage's mum. It does make a lot of sense that Mirage's dad could have been the person trying to bribe her to not tell his son that he was coming. That makes a lot more sense compared to someone like Eduardo Silva, who probably wouldn't even have to be interviewed by Grace Rasheed. He's that powerful that I think he can just sort of sidestep that. He doesn't have to bribe someone that low down the chain, in comparison to him at least. Grace Rasheed is obviously still relatively high up within the Syndicate's power structure, at least as Director of Security. So it seems we've largely figured out all of the characters that initial setup was giving us, and we're evidently going to be seeing those characters serve as cruxes for plot points throughout this season. So at this point, hands up in the air. No real actual answers, but that makes sense. We're still, as I said, we're still actually much earlier into this story than it might seem for the 7-8 chapters that we actually have by this point. Potentially 9 by the time that anyone really sees this video. So with that obviously went on maybe a little longer than I intended. Some good little background info to keep you up to date with what's going on for the community chapter, and a nice little look into the various arcs of the characters mentioned here as they'll progress through the season. I am worried that Loba's going to push herself a little too far and get herself infected, but who knows where that could lead. With that, that's enough out of me for today. Thank you for staying with me, friends. I've been Euclidean Vision, the emotional support. Hope you enjoyed the chapter, and my thoughts as ever. Take care of yourselves out there, teammates, and may the glorious light of Baskerville shine within you. Bye-bye.